We're going to continue with the fourth chapter of the Wolves of Willoughby Chase. When we left off, Sylvia was introduced to Bonnie's parents, who very quickly left on their trip, and Bonnie and Sylvia decided to go ice skating. And they saw Miss Slycarp, the governess, talking to some woman. They couldn't figure out who it was, but they had skated quite a ways away to follow her, and Sylvia, who has never ice skated before, is now very tired and sitting on a bank, and the wolves are coming, and that is where we will pick up the story. "No, it's not to be thought of," Bonnie said decisively. "I have a better plan. We must take off our skates. Can you manage? Make haste, then." They sat on a clump of brush by the river's edge, and with chilled fingers tugged at the knots in their bootlaces. Sylvia shivered as once again the wolf cry stole over the frozen parkland. It had been bad enough, heard from the train, but now, when there was nothing between them and those pitiless legions, how dread it sounded. The children stood up, slinging their skates round their necks. "Now we must climb this little hill," Bonnie said. "Here, I'll take your hand. Can you run?" "Famous Sylvia, you are the bravest creature in the world, and when we get home I shall give you my little ivory work-box to show how sorry I am for having led you into such a scrape." Sylvia did her best to smile at her cousin, having no breath to answer, and tried to stifle all doubts that they ever would get home. Arrived at the top of the hill, Bonnie stood still, and, as it seemed to Sylvia, wasted precious moments while she glanced keenly about her through the rapid thickening snowstorm. "Ah!" she cried presently. "The Temple of Hermes! We must go this way." She tugged Sylvia at a run down the slope, and across a wide intervening stretch of open ground toward a little pillared pavilion that stood on an artificial knoll against some dark trees. They had now put the river between them and the cry of the wolves, which was comforting, but Sylvia was dismayed to see that Bonnie was once more leading her away from the house. "Where are we going, Bonnie?" she panted, fighting bravely to keep up. "I have a friend who lives in the woods," Bonnie returned. "I only hope he is not away. Let us rest a moment here." They stood, struggling to get their breath in the Temple of Hermes, which was no more than a roof supported on slender columns. "Oh, Bonnie, look! Look!" Sylvia cried in uncontrollable alarm, pointing back the way they had come. Through the dusk, they could just distinguish two small black dots at the top of the slope, which were soon joined by several others. After a moment, all these dots began coursing swiftly down the hillside in their direction. "There is not a moment to be lost," Bonnie said urgently. Make haste," half leading, half supporting the exhausted Sylvia. She urged her on through the deepening woods. Here, Bonnie seemed to know her way almost by instinct. She passed from tree to tree, scanning them apparently for signs invisible to her cousin. "Here we are!" she exclaimed in a tone of of unutterable thankfulness, and, to Sylvia's astonishment, she put her fingers to her lips and gave vent to a long, clear whistle. More surprising still, she was instantly answered by another whistle, which seemed to come from the very ground beneath their feet. A clear, ringing voice called, "Here, Miss Bonnie! Here, quick!" Sylvia found a lithe, bright-eyed boy beside her, helping her on. Taller than Bonnie, he was dressed entirely in skins. He wore a fur cap, carried a bow, and had a sheaf of arrows slung over his shoulder. At the first, the wolf pack found their track in the Temple of Hermes, and came raging after along the clear scent. The boy turned, fitted an arrow in his bow, and sent it unerringly into the midst of the pursuers. One wolf fell, and his companions immediately hurled themselves upon him with starving ferocity. "That gives us breathing space," the boy exclaimed. "Inside, Miss Bonnie. Don't lose a moment." With Bonnie tugging at her hand, and the boy guarding the rear, threatening the wolves with his bow, Sylvia found herself whisked down a long, narrow path, or passageway, snow-lined at first, then floored with dead leaves. It was dark. She was in a cave, and more curious still, she could feel a number of live creatures pushing against her legs, almost overbalancing her. They were soft and smooth, and she could hear an angry hissing coming from them, which almost drowned the clamor of the wolves outside. She would have cried out in fright if she had any breath left. And then she and Bonnie rounded a corner in a passage and saw before them the comfortable glow of a fire burning on a sandy hearth. Heaped up piles of ferns and dead leaves covered with furs lay against the cave walls, and on these Bonnie and Sylvia flung themselves, and even Bonnie could now acknowledge that she was nearly fainting from weariness. "There," the boy said, following them in. "Now shut the gate. They'll not catch you this time." "But what was you doing, Miss Bonnie, so far from the house on a night like this? It's not like you to take such a foolish risk." As Bonnie began explaining how it had come about, Sylvia was amazed to see a number of large white geese waddle after the boy into the cave. They looked rather threateningly out of their flat, black, beady eyes at Sylvia and Bonnie. One or two of them thrust out their necks and hissed, but the boy waved them back into the passage and flung them a handful of corn to keep them quiet. Lulled by the flickering firelight and the long white necks weaving up and down in the entrance as the geese pecked their corn, Sylvia, who was half stupefied by exhaustion, fell fast asleep. When she awoke, it was the sound of voices. Bonnie was saying anxiously, "But, Simon, we cannot stay here all night. My dear Patton will be so worried. She will be certain the wolves have got us, and Miss Slycop, too, will be concerned. Perhaps they have already sent the men out searching for us." "I'll have a look in a moment," the boy returned. "Now, if you'll wake your cousin, miss, the cakes are ready, and you'll both feel better on full stomachs than empty." He spoke with a pleasant country burr. Sylvia, lying drowsy on her heap of leaves, thought his voice had a comfortable brown furry sound to it. "Sylvia, wake up," Bonnie said. "Here's Simon made us some delicious cakes, and if you are like me, you are ravenous with hunger." "Indeed I am." Rubbing her eyes, Sylvia brushed off the leaves and sat up. The boy had separated the fire into two glowing hillocks. From between them he now pulled a flat stone on which were baking a number of little cakes. The two children ate them hungrily as soon as they were cool enough to hold. They were brown on the outside, white and floury within, and sweet to the taste. "Your cakes are splendid, Simon," Bonnie said. "How do you make them?" "From chestnut flour, Miss Bonnie. I gather up the chestnuts in the autumn, pound them to flour between two stones." While they were eating, he went along the entrance passage. In a minute he came back to say, "Wolves have gone, and it's a fine sharp night, all spiky with stars. No sign of men out searching, Miss Bonnie. It's my belief we'd best be off now while the way's clear. Do you think you can walk as far as the house, Miss Sylvia?" "Oh, yes, I feel perfectly rested," declared Sylvia, but she was obliged to acknowledge when she stood up that she still found herself stiff and tired and would be unable to keep up a very fast pace. "I have badly overtaxed your strength this first day," exclaimed Bonnie self-reproachfully. "Still, if you can walk, Sylvia, I think we should be off now and save our poor Patton some hours of dreadful worry." "Certainly I can walk," said Sylvia stoutly. "Let us start at once," though inwardly her heart quailed somewhat at the thought of the wolves very likely still in the neighborhood. "A moment before we start," the boy Simon dug in shallow sand at the side of the cave and brought out a large leather bottle and a horn drinking cup. He gave the girls each a small drink from the bottle. It was strong, heady stuff, tasting of honey. "That will hearten you for the walk," he said. "What is it, Simon?" "Metheglin, miss. I make it in the summer from the heather honey." He picked up his bow and flung a few logs on the fire. The children resumed their furs, which they had taken off at the first entry into the warm cave. "I do love your home, Simon," Bonnie exclaimed. "I hate to leave it." "You, miss," he said, grinning, "with your grand house, and a different room for each day of the year. Well, yes, of course, I love that too. But this is so snug." Simon quieted the geese, who raised their necks and hissed as the children passed them. "I wish I had another weapon to defend you with," he muttered. "One bow is hardly sufficient for 3. I will cut you a cudgel when we are outside, Miss Bonnie." "I know, Simon," Bonnie cried. "My old fowling piece that I left here that rainy day last autumn. I have never thought of it since. Have you it still?" "Of course I have," he said, his face lighting up. "And carefully oiled, too, with neat's foot oil. It is in good order, Miss Bonnie. I am glad you reminded me of it. What a fool I was not to think of it before." He took it down from where it hung on the passage wall in a leather sack. Bonnie, somewhat to her cousin's alarm and amazement, handled the gun confidently, and soon satisfied herself of its being in excellent order and ready to fire. "Now let's be off," she said gaily. "I can keep the villains at a distance with this." They went out into the clear, sparkling night. The new snow, which had obliterated both their footprints and those of the wolves, made a crisp carpet beneath their feet. Bonnie and Simon kept a vigilant lookout for wolves, and Sylvia did too, though secretly she felt she was almost less afraid of the wolves than of her cousin Bonnie's gun. However, there was no occasion to use the fowling piece, as the wolves appeared to have left the region at the moment, drawn away, doubtless, by some new quarry. Their journey back to the house was quiet and uninterrupted. "It is strange," remarked Bonnie in a puzzled voice, "that we do not see men out everywhere with lanterns searching for us. Why, the time I was late back from picking wild strawberries, my father had every man in the estate out with pitchforks and muskets." "Aye," said Simon, "but your father's far from home now, isn't he, Miss Bonnie?" "Yes, he is," answered Bonnie, sighing. "I suppose that is the reason." And she fell into a rather sad silence. When they reached the great terrace, Bonnie suggested that they should go in by a side entrance, and thus avoid informing Miss Slycarp of their return. "For it is possible that Patten, fearing her anger, has left her in ignorance that we were out," she suggested thoughtfully. "I believe Patten is a little frightened of Miss Slycarp." "I am sure I am," Sylvia agreed. "There is something so cold and glittering about her eyes, and then her voice is so disagreeable. I dare say that is the reason, Bonnie." As they passed a large lighted window, Bonnie murmured, "That is the great library, Sylvia, where my father keeps all his books and papers. I will show you over it tomorrow." "Why, what a curious thing!" she exclaimed, for glancing in as they walked by, they saw Miss Slycarp under the illumination of numerous candles, apparently hard at work searching through a mass of papers. There were papers on chairs, on tables, on the floor. Beyond her, at the far end of the room, similarly engaged, was a gentleman who looked amazingly like Mr. Grimshaw. Could it be he? But at the slight noise made by their feet on the snow, Miss Slycarp turned. She could not see the watchers who were beyond the lighted area near the window, but she crossed with a decisive step and flung the heavy velvet curtains, shutting off the scene within. "What can she be doing?" Bonnie exclaimed. "And was that not Mr. Grimshaw? Dr. Morn said he should not get out of bed." "Perhaps she is familiarizing herself with the contents of your father's papers," Sylvia suggested. "Did you not say she was to look after the estate? And I am not sure that was Mr. Grimshaw. We had hardly time to see." Arrived at the little postern door, they had scarcely knocked before it was flung open, and Pattern had enveloped them in her arms. "Oh, you naughty, naughty, precious children! How could you? How could you? Here's my poor heart been nearly broke in half with fright at thinking you was eaten by the wolves, and Miss Slycarp saying no such thing. You'd come home soon, and me saying, 'Begging your pardon, miss, but you don't know this park and these wolves as I do,' and begging her to tell the men to sound the alarm. But no, my lady knows best what's to be done, and it's my belief nothing ever would have been done till we found some boots and buttons of you in the snow, and the rest of you ate up by wolves. You hadn't come home all by yourselves, you good, wicked, precious, naughty lambs. Oh!" And faithful Pattern relieved herself by a burst of tears. "Not by ourselves, Pattern," said Bonnie, hugging her tightly. "Simon brought us home. We were chased by wolves, though it wasn't exactly our fault, and he hid us in his cave till they were gone." "Never will I hear a word against that boy. Some say he's a wicked vagabond gypsy, but I say he's the best-hearted, trustiest. Ask him in, Miss Bonnie, and I'll give him the Christmas pudding that was too big to go in my lady's valise." But the silent Simon, overwhelmed perhaps by Pattern's flow of words, had melted away into the night without waiting to be thanked. "Will he be all right?" breathed Sylvia, big-eyed with horror. "Won't the wolves get him on the way home?" "I don't believe they could ever catch him," Bonnie reassured her. "He can run so fast. Besides, he has his bow. And then, too, he can climb trees and swing from branch to branch if they get near him." "Never mind about him. Nothing ever hurts Simon," bustled Pattern, half pushing, half pulling them up the little back stairs. "Come on with you now, till I get a posset inside you." Cold in spite of their furs, the children were glad to be sat down before a glowing fire in the night nursery, while Pattern scolded and clucked, and brushed the tangles out of their hair, brought in with her own hands the big silver bathtub filled with steaming water in which bunches of lemon mint had been steeped, giving a deliciously fragrant scent, and bathed them, each in turn, afterward wrapping them in voluminous warm white flannel gowns. And we will pause there.